There is a preparation that neuroscientists at Harvard University describe in their publications as the most powerful intervention on human consciousness that modern science has ever studied, and which 17th-century Jesuit missionaries simply called the brew from hell. It's not a pill developed in a Swiss laboratory. It's not a molecule synthesized in the last 20 years. It's a mixture of two plants that have grown in the Amazon basin since before writing existed in the Americas, prepared and administered with a ritual precision that would take several episodes to fully describe. A mixture that was persecuted, prohibited, classified as poison, as witchcraft, as a substance of abuse, and that today is being administered in the clinical facilities of some of the world's most prestigious universities to patients whom conventional psychiatry has declared incurable. This is the story of how the most sophisticated knowledge about the human mind that the Americas produced was first destroyed by religion, then criminalized by governments, and finally rediscovered by science, with a 400-year delay that has a human cost that no one has yet calculated. But before reaching the Harvard laboratories, one must enter the jungle. Imagine the Ucayali River in the Peruvian Amazon in the mid-16th century. The waters are dark and swift in the center, slow and reflective at the banks, where the trees reach into the river as if to drink. The air smells of damp earth and flowers that have no name in any European language. It is August, in the dry season, when the morning mist dissipates before 8 o'clock and the rainforest reveals its full architecture. The canopy 40 meters high, the understory in shadow below, and in that space in between, hanging from the trunks and climbing among the branches, a liana with striated brown bark that the Shipibo call oni, and whose botanical name is Banisteriopsis caapi. The liana is not simply gathered haphazardly. The Shipibo healer, the onanya, which literally means the one who knows with the eye of the spirit, can spend years identifying the right plants, recognizing by the color of the leaves, the texture of the bark, the tree's position in the forest, which ones possess the properties he seeks. The most experienced can distinguish up to a dozen varieties of the liana with slightly different properties. This distinction does not exist in any Western botanical manual. It exists only in the memory of the onanya, passed down from master to apprentice for generations, in a training process that can last between 5 and 15 years and includes periods of isolation, strict diets, sexual abstinence, and a learning relationship with the plant itself that Western science lacks the conceptual framework to describe, yet which produces measurable results. To the liana is added the leaf of another plant, Psychotria viridis, which the Shipibo call chacruna, and which grows as a shrub with dark, glossy leaves in the humid undergrowth. The combination of the two plants is what makes possible the effect that has perplexed modern neurochemists, and this combination is neither accidental nor intuitive. It is the result of a process of empirical research that, according to the most conservative estimates based on archaeological dates from sites in Ecuador and Peru, has involved at least 3,000 years of systematic refinement. It's worth pausing here for a moment because this combination is pharmacologically extraordinary and deserves an explanation that the script can't skip. Psychotria viridis contains dimethyltryptamine, an extremely potent psychoactive compound that the human body produces endogenously in trace amounts, and that is also present in dozens of plants worldwide. If ingested alone, dimethyltryptamine is destroyed almost immediately by a digestive enzyme called monoamine oxidase before it can reach the brain. Simply put, it's active, but the body deactivates it before it can do anything. Banisteriopsis caapi contains harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine, which are inhibitors of precisely that enzyme. When taken together, the vine blocks the breakdown of dimethyltryptamine, allowing it to reach the brain. How did the Shipibo people, 3,000 years ago, discover that these two specific plants, among the hundreds of thousands of species in the Amazon, had to be combined in that exact proportion to produce that effect? Western science has no answer. The Shipibo answer is that the plant itself taught them. This answer makes Western science uncomfortable, but the pharmacological fact remains. The combination is correct, the mechanism is real, and no one has proposed a more plausible explanation for how it was discovered. In the Shipibo tradition, the preparation of ayahuasca is not a culinary act. It is the beginning of a complex therapeutic process involving the healer, the patient, the community, and entities that the Shipibo cosmological system conceives as plant spirits, and that modern neuroscience would tentatively describe as altered states of information processing. The shaman works during the ceremony with icaros, healing songs with a precise musical structure that researchers at Purdue University have analyzed in terms of their effect on brain coherence as measured by electroencephalography. The icaros are not decoration, they are part of the therapeutic protocol. Without them, tradition indicates that the process can be unpredictable or dangerous. This medical system functioned with a sophistication that the first Europeans who observed it were completely incapable of understanding, not due to intellectual limitations, but rather limitations in their conceptual framework. For a Jesuit missionary trained in 17th-century scholasticism, what he saw in an ayahuasca ceremony fit into only one available category: witchcraft. Not because he necessarily wanted to destroy it, but because it was literally the only way he had of processing what he was witnessing. The earliest European record of ayahuasca that historians have been able to date with certainty comes from Father Cristóbal de Acunha, a Jesuit who accompanied Pedro Teixeira's Portuguese expedition along the Amazon in 1639. Acunha describes a drink that the Indians take to speak with the devil, and documents that its effects last for several hours and produce visions. His description is not hostile by nature. Acunha was an intelligent observer who documented many things about the Amazon with relative accuracy. But his interpretive framework compels him to classify what he sees within the category of the diabolical, which automatically determines the institutional response that follows. The Jesuit and Franciscan missions established along the Amazonian tributaries during the 17th and 18th centuries had a relatively consistent policy regarding ayahuasca. It was not, in most cases, a violent persecution similar to that seen with peyote in Mexico or coca in the Andes. It was a policy of systematic delegitimization. The ayahuasca user was redescribed as a sorcerer or witch doctor. Their practices were portrayed to the community as deceptions of the devil. And the missionaries' consistent recommendation to their converts was to abandon the use of the drink, to seek the sacraments instead, and to report those who continued to use it. The effectiveness of this campaign was uneven. In the communities most deeply penetrated by the missions, the use of ayahuasca in ritual contexts decreased significantly. In more remote communities, or those more resistant to evangelization, it continued uninterrupted. But what was almost universally eroded was the status of the onanya, a traditional healer, as a legitimate medical figure. In the new colonial order, legitimate medical knowledge was that of European physicians trained in the Galenic tradition, and that knowledge had no place for dimethyltryptamine, harmine, or icaros, a type of herbal medicine. There is an archival document that is particularly revealing of this dynamic. It is a letter from Father Samuel Fritz, a German Jesuit who worked in the missions of the Upper Amazon between 1684 and 1724, addressed to his superiors in Quito. Fritz describes an episode in which a local missionary tried to convince the community to abandon a healing ceremony that an onanya, shaman, was performing for a seriously ill person. The community refused. The sick person survived. The missionary recorded the event with a mixture of frustration and perplexity that, read from the 21st century, is almost touching. The man was not evil. He didn't understand what he was seeing. And that lack of understanding, multiplied by 1,000 missionaries in hundreds of communities over 3 centuries, was enough to erode, though not destroy, one of the most sophisticated medical systems that the American continent had produced. The erosion was not complete for a simple reason. The Amazon rainforest is difficult to control. The most remote communities of the Ucayali, Marañón, Juruá, and Putumayo rivers were weeks away from any major mission. The onanya could retreat into the forest with their knowledge and reappear when the missionaries left, which happened with some regularity due to disease, relocations, and the abandonment of missions. Knowledge of ayahuasca survived not despite colonial pressure, but in the margins that this pressure could not fully reach. But the margins kept narrowing. The 19th century brought a new form of pressure, the rubber boom. Between 1850 and 1912, the Amazon basin was subjected to one of the most brutal systems of forced labor in the history of the Americas. Indigenous communities in Peru, Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador were enslaved to extract latex from rubber trees under conditions that historians have compared to the Belgian Congo under Leopold II. The Peruvian historian Alberto Flores Galindo documented that in certain regions of the Peruvian Amazon, the indigenous population was reduced by between 50 and 90% during the rubber boom due to a combination of forced labor, disease, and direct violence. In that context, the Shipibo medical system and those of other Amazonian nations suffered a loss of transmitters that was, in some cases, irreversible. When an Onanya dies without having been able to complete the training of an apprentice, it is not just an individual who dies. A body of knowledge dies that does not exist in any book, in any archive, in any database. It dies within him. The 20th century brought a new threat, this time in the form of law. The United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, adopted in 1961, placed dimethyltryptamine, DMT, in Schedule 1 of internationally prohibited substances, which, legally speaking, means it is considered to have a high potential for abuse and no acceptable medical use. Harmine was left in a more ambiguous situation. Technically, it was not explicitly prohibited by the same convention, but national laws treated it inconsistently. The practical effect was that ayahuasca as a brew fell into a legal gray area that depended on the country, effectively prohibited in most, ambiguously tolerated in some, and formally protected as cultural heritage only in Peru, where the government recognized it in 1994 as a cultural expression of Amazonian communities. In the United States, the Drug Enforcement Administration classified dimethyltryptamine, DMT, as a Schedule I controlled substance in 1971, under the Controlled Substances Act signed by President Nixon. Schedule I is the most restrictive, reserved for substances with high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use in the United States, and lack of accepted safety even under medical supervision. It's the same category as heroin, the same category as LSD. It's the same category that excludes, for example, methamphetamine, which is Schedule II because it has approved medical uses, and oxycodone, which has killed more people in the United States in the last 20 years than DMT has in all of recorded human history. The Schedule I classification was not just a statement of public policy. It was an effective roadblock to scientific research. To study a Schedule I substance in the United States, researchers need special permits from the Drug Enforcement Administration that are extraordinarily difficult to obtain, require expensive security infrastructure, and must be renewed through bureaucratic procedures that can take years. The result was that between 1972 and 2016, clinical research with dimethyltryptamine in the United States was virtually non-existent. Not because scientists didn't have questions, but because the legal system made asking those questions nearly impossible. In that 4-decade gap, the knowledge that the Shipibo Onanya had accumulated over 3,000 years continued to be used in the jungle and in the cities of Lima, Iquitos, and Pucallpa by communities that didn't wait for Harvard or New York University to tell them that what they were doing was valid. And during that same period, without publications in restricted access journals or lectures at universities, that knowledge began to circulate northward. The first widespread contact between the urban Spanish-speaking world and ayahuasca wasn't academic, it was literary. In 1905, the Ecuadorian poet Medardo Ángel Silva mentioned ayahuasca in a poem, likely the first use of the term in Spanish literature. But the encounter that truly opened a door was that of the American writer William Burroughs and the ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes, whose exchanges about the Peruvian Amazon in the 1950s circulated in the beatnik circles of New York and San Francisco, creating an initial layer of Western knowledge about the plant that was, at best, partial and, at worst, distorted by the lens of exoticism. Exoticism is, in its own way, as destructive as religious persecution. It transforms a sophisticated medical system into a spiritual tourism accessory, a weekend experience, something consumed without the context that makes it functional and safe. The proliferation of ayahuasca centers in Peru since the 1990s, many run by untrained individuals as onanya, a traditional healer, and many primarily geared toward wellness tourism for wealthy people from the global north, represents a painful paradox. The very plant that missionaries persecuted as witchcraft was now being romanticized as a spiritual experience, with results that, in the most serious cases, include death from drug interactions, psychosis in people with undiagnosed predispositions, and the exploitation of indigenous communities that receive a minimal fraction of the money circulating around them. But there was something more, something that wasn't tourism and wasn't romanticism. In the 1990s and early 2000s, a small number of researchers trained in psychiatry and neuroscience began to observe something they couldn't explain with the available conceptual tools. War veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder who had resisted years of conventional psychotherapy and combinations of medications that left them functional but empty began to report, after 1 or 2 sessions with a Shipibo healer in Iquitos, a remission of symptoms that lasted for months. People with severe cocaine or heroin addiction, resistant to all available treatments, described an experience that interrupted the compulsion in a way unlike anything conventional psychiatry had produced. Women with major depression who had tried 6, 8, 10 different antidepressants without lasting results reported that after a single session, something fundamental had changed in the way their minds related to pain. These reports were anecdotal. They were impossible to publish in peer-reviewed journals without a controlled study design. And a controlled study design with dimethyltryptamine was virtually impossible to obtain in the United States. The first institutional breakthrough came from outside the United States. In Brazil, where ayahuasca has been legal since 1987 for religious use by the Santo Daime and União do Vegetal churches, research groups from the Federal University of São Paulo and the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte began publishing data on the effects of ayahuasca in clinical populations starting in the first decade of the 21st century. This data was methodologically more robust than anecdotal reports, although still far from the standards of a randomized controlled trial. Then, something changed. And what changed wasn't the plant. It was the political context. The mental health crisis in Western countries reached dimensions in the second decade of the 21st century that health authorities could no longer ignore. Major depression affected more than 17 million adults in the United States. Post-traumatic stress disorder, especially among veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, was resisting available treatments with a frequency that constituted a public health emergency. Suicide rates among veterans reached 20 per day in some years. And the pharmaceutical industry, which had dominated the treatment of mental disorders since the 1950s with tricyclic antidepressants, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and, finally, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, had no answer for this population of treatment-resistant patients. It was in this context of urgency that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration made a decision in 2019 that would have seemed unthinkable 20 years earlier. It granted breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin, the active compound in psilocybin mushrooms, for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. This designation did not legalize psilocybin, but it did send an unequivocal signal to researchers. The path to clinical trials was open. And if psilocybin could follow it, so could dimethyltryptamine. By then, research groups at Johns Hopkins University, New York University, and Imperial College London had already been accumulating data for years that pointed in the same direction. Studies with psilocybin published in journals such as JAMA Psychiatry and The Lancet Psychiatry showed remission rates in treatment-resistant depression that no conventional antidepressant had achieved in 40 years of research. And the neurobiological mechanisms proposed to explain these results, increased synaptic plasticity, modulation of the default mode network, disruption of entrenched ruminative thought patterns, were the same ones that dimethyltryptamine researchers had been describing in their publications for a decade. In 2023, the psychopharmacology group at Johns Hopkins University, led by Dr. Matthew Johnson, published the first data from a treatment protocol using intravenous dimethyltryptamine in patients with treatment-resistant major depressive disorder. The results, though preliminary, were of a magnitude that the typically cautious scientific language of academic publications could barely contain. An average reduction in depression scores that, in some patients, exceeded 70%, with effects that persisted for weeks after a single administration. And at that precise point, in that Baltimore hospital room in the year 2023, the arc of the story closes in a way that is somewhat overwhelming if one stops to think about it. The Jesuits in the Amazon had been pursuing that same substance since 1639. The Drug Enforcement Administration had classified it as equivalent to heroin in 1971. And 384 years after Father Acuña's report, doctors at Johns Hopkins University Hospital were injecting it into the veins of their most difficult patients with the blessing of the Food and Drug Administration, with heart monitors, safety protocols, informed consent, and publications in peer-reviewed journals. The Shipibo people of the Ucayali River have known this for 3,000 years, and nobody asked them. The data from Johns Hopkins University did not arrive alone or suddenly. Behind that hospital room in Baltimore is a chain of researchers who began working on the margins of the scientific system long before the system was willing to listen to them, and who published their results in journals that the psychiatry departments of large university hospitals systematically ignored because the studies came from Brazil, Peru, Spain, places that the map of hegemonic science placed on the periphery. One of the first to publish controlled clinical data was the Brazilian psychiatrist Jaime Halak from the neuroscience department at the University of São Paulo. His group published the results of a pilot study in the Journal of Clinical Psychopharmacology in 2012. The study involved depressed patients who had received a single dose of ayahuasca in a controlled setting. The reduction in symptoms was rapid, in some cases visible within the first 80 hours, and statistically significant compared to the control group. The study was small, as is typical of a pilot study, but it was rigorous and publishable. Halak and his team presented it not as a miracle, but as what it was, a sign that warranted further investigation. At the same time, in Spain, the neuropsychopharmacology group at the Hospital de la Santa Creu i Sant Pau in Barcelona, affiliated with the Autonomous University of Barcelona, began publishing studies on the effects of harmine and tetrahydroharmine, the beta-carboline alkaloids of Banisteriopsis caapi, on brain neuroplasticity. What they found was unexpected even for them. Harmine stimulates the synthesis of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, known as BDNF, which is one of the most important molecules in the formation of new synaptic connections. BDNF is, simply put, the brain's molecular fertilizer. When its levels are low, as is consistently the case in major depression, the brain's ability to form new connections and break old patterns is reduced. When its levels rise, the brain regains what researchers call a window of plasticity, a period in which established patterns can be rewritten. Conventional antidepressants, especially selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, which have dominated the market since the 1990s, also raise BDNF levels, but they do so slowly. The effect accumulates after weeks of continuous use, which explains why patients take between 2 and 6 weeks to feel better, and why a significant proportion of them never respond. Harmine, according to studies by the Barcelona group, raises BDNF levels more directly and more quickly. And dimethyltryptamine, DMT, according to parallel research from Imperial College London, published in the journal Neuropsychopharmacology in 2021, activates sigma-1 receptors in the central nervous system that are directly involved in neuroplasticity and in reducing neuronal inflammation, one of the most consistent biological markers of treatment-resistant chronic depression. To understand why this matters more than it first appears, an analogy helps. Imagine the chronically depressed brain as a city whose streets are frozen in a fixed pattern. Trucks always follow the same routes, circuits always fire in the same order, and thoughts always return to the same dead ends. Conventional antidepressants work like infrastructure maintenance. They gradually improve the overall condition of the streets, but don't change the map. What the researchers proposed dimethyltryptamine does is different. It temporarily opens up the possibility of laying out new streets. It doesn't change the map itself, but it creates the period of time in which the map can be changed. That is precisely what the Shipibo-Conibo have been doing for 3,000 years with their protocol of icaros, ritual preparation, and post-ceremony integration work. They didn't administer the plant and send the patient home. They worked with them during the opening period to guide the process of cognitive and emotional reorganization. Modern neuroscience has a word for that: psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. The Shipibo had another: medicine. Robin Carhart-Harris's research group at Imperial College London, one of the teams that has contributed most to the neuroscience understanding of these substances, published a randomized clinical trial in Nature Medicine in 2022. The study, which examined psilocybin in treatment-resistant depression, showed comparable efficacy to escitalopram, one of the world's most widely prescribed antidepressants, with one key difference. Patients treated with psilocybin showed a greater reduction in what researchers call ruminative thinking and a greater ability to connect with their own emotions, two dimensions that escitalopram does not significantly affect. Patients taking the conventional antidepressant described their lives as better but cushioned. Those receiving psilocybin in psychotherapy-assisted therapy described something different: clarity, presence. The ability to feel again. Why are we talking about psilocybin if the topic is ayahuasca? Because the mechanisms researchers propose to explain the effects of both substances are similar enough that the results from one can illuminate the other. And because psilocybin research, which was able to advance more quickly for logistical and political reasons that are irrelevant here, is paving the regulatory path that dimethyltryptamine needs to follow. In 2023, Dr. Christopher Timmerman's group at Imperial College published the first results of intravenous dimethyltryptamine, DMT, administration in healthy volunteers and in a first cohort of patients with treatment-resistant major depressive disorder. The intravenous dose has a characteristic that distinguishes it from traditional ayahuasca. The effect lasts between 20 and 30 minutes instead of 4 to 6 hours, making it more manageable in a clinical setting and allowing its administration in a hospital without the need for an extended overnight session. The preliminary results were significant enough for the study to advance to Phase 2, the level at which efficacy and safety are tested in larger groups of patients. In Colombia, the University of Antioquia has been coordinating a Latin American research network since 2018 on the therapeutic effects of Amazonian psychoactive plants, which includes groups from Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, and Mexico. The network's contribution is particularly valuable because it studies not only the effects of isolated dimethyltryptamine, DMT, but also the entire system: the plant, the ritual, the icaros, traditional songs, the healer, and the community. Preliminary results from the network's first studies, published in the Latin American and Caribbean Bulletin of Medicinal and Aromatic Plants, suggest that the ritual context amplifies and stabilizes the therapeutic effects in a way that is not replicated when the isolated substance is administered without that context. In terms of drug design, this would be an impossible patent to register. In terms of Latin American public health, it is a powerful reason to protect and strengthen the communities that possess this knowledge instead of simply extracting the molecule. There is a dimension to this story that clinical studies are only now beginning to document, but which the Shipibo-Conibo could have explained precisely centuries ago. Ayahuasca is not a substance to be taken alone, in the darkness of an apartment, without preparation or subsequent integration. Amazonian traditions point this out with a clarity that accidents at unregulated spiritual tourism centers have tragically confirmed. Researchers at Johns Hopkins and Imperial College reiterate this in every publication. The substance is not the treatment. The substance plus the context plus integrative psychotherapy is the treatment. Separating the molecule from the system in which it developed, as if the context were a dispensable embellishment, is as fundamental an error as removing insulin from the pancreas and leaving the patient without diet or follow-up. This is the point where history becomes political, and it must be said clearly. The Western regulatory system is prepared to approve molecules. It is not prepared to approve systems. It can patent a purified dimethyltryptamine extract administered in a standardized 20-minute protocol in a hospital room. It cannot patent the icaros of a Shipibo-Conibo. It cannot patent 3,000 years' worth of knowledge about the correct timing of the dose, patient selection, support during the experience, and the integration work in the weeks that follow. What this means in economic terms is that the part of the therapeutic system that generates value for the Shipibo communities, their knowledge, their traditions, their generations of empirical research, is precisely the part that the regulatory system neither recognizes nor protects. The part that can be regulated, patented, and commercialized is the molecule that these communities discovered. The mechanism is no different from what we've already seen with quachilalate, quinoa, neem, and hundreds of other natural resources that the communities of origin identified, developed, and preserved for centuries, only for the global North industry to arrive, isolate the active ingredient, register the patent, and sell them back the product at Swiss pharmacy prices. We unearth these kinds of stories every week, stories that industry, oblivion, and politics have tried to erase from the map. If you don't want to miss any, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. But knowledge, like the Ukiali liana, has an extraordinary capacity to survive the pressure of those who try to suppress it. The Shipibo-Conibo communities of the Ukiali River are not waiting for Harvard or Imperial College to explain what they know. What they are doing, with a political clarity that sometimes surprises the researchers who work with them, is documenting their own knowledge, establishing their own informed consent protocols for those who wish to conduct research with their participation, and organizing themselves to demand a share of the benefits of any pharmaceutical development derived from their knowledge. The organization IDACEP, the Interethnic Association for the Development of the Peruvian Rainforest, has issued specific declarations on the intellectual property of Amazonian medical knowledge that are remarkable documents of customary law applied to the biotechnological era. In Brazil, the União do Vegetal and the Santo Daime churches have set a legal precedent that is studied in law schools in several countries. In 2016, they obtained a decision from the United States Supreme Court protecting their right to the religious use of ayahuasca in that country, marking the first time an Anglo-Saxon legal system recognized the value of a medical religious practice of Amazonian origin. It is not legalization, but it is recognition. In Peru, where the government declared ayahuasca a national cultural heritage in 1994, the National Institute of Health began developing a regulatory framework for traditional medicine centers in 2020. This framework includes minimum standards for healer training, protocols for evaluating candidates for ceremonies, and systems for reporting adverse events. It is not perfect. It faces implementation challenges in remote areas and resistance from some sectors that view any regulation as a threat to indigenous autonomy. However, it represents an attempt to integrate traditional knowledge into the public health system without destroying or reducing it to mere folklore. For those reading this from a Spanish-speaking country where dimethyltryptamine, DMT, has an ambiguous legal status, which is most of Latin America and Spain, it's important to be very clear about the current state of research. The clinical studies we've described were conducted under controlled conditions, with selected patients, prior psychiatric evaluation, medical supervision during the experiment, and post-treatment reintegration programs. They are not endorsements for recreational or unsupervised use. The contraindications are important and must be taken seriously. DMT should not be used by people with a personal or family history of schizophrenia, bipolar I disorder, or psychosis of any kind, because it can precipitate episodes that do not resolve spontaneously. Interaction with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, can produce serotonin syndrome, which is a medical emergency. Interaction with prescription monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs, is potentially fatal. These are not label warnings to fulfill a requirement. These are real contraindications that the Shipibo people also know and that are part of the candidate selection protocol that their traditions have developed over centuries. Having said all this, if clinical research in the coming years confirms what preliminary studies suggest, the impact on global mental health could be of a magnitude that psychiatry has not seen since the introduction of antidepressants in the 1950s, or possibly even earlier. Treatment-resistant major depressive disorder affects, according to World Health Organization estimates, between 15 and 30% of all patients diagnosed with depression. Post-traumatic stress disorder affects hundreds of millions of people worldwide, including victims of domestic violence, natural disasters, armed conflict, and childhood abuse. If there is a therapeutic system that produces lasting remission in patients who have resisted all available treatments, with effects that persist for months after a single intervention, the question public health must ask itself is not whether it can be ignored. The question is why it took 400 years to study it. We already know the answer. We don't need to repeat it. What we do need to say is where this living knowledge resides today. The Shipibo elders of the Ucayali region, especially the communities of Pucallpa and those organized around the Pisqui River, maintain a tradition of active training that several international cooperation organizations are helping to document and protect. The Taquihuasi Center in Tarapoto, Peru, founded by the French physician Jacques Mabit and run for decades in collaboration with local Amazonian healers, conducts clinical work with people suffering from severe addictions in a format that integrates Shipibo knowledge with contemporary medical protocols. It has published long-term follow-up results that are among the most comprehensive available in the literature on addiction treatment with ayahuasca. In Spain, several research groups affiliated with the Spanish National Research Council, CSIC, are conducting Phase 1 and Phase 2 studies with standardized harmine and tetrahydroharmine extracts in patients with major depressive disorder, following the path pioneered by Brazilian studies a decade ago. The European legal framework is, in this respect, slightly more flexible than the American one for certain basic research studies, although regulatory barriers for clinical trials with substances on the European Union's list of controlled substances remain significant. In Mexico, the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of the National Polytechnic Institute has neurobiology groups that have begun studying the mechanisms of harmine on neuroplasticity in cell models, which is the first step, albeit still a long way off, toward clinical studies in the Mexican population. In Argentina, the University of Buenos Aires has psychiatry researchers who participate in international research networks on psychedelics and are positioned to contribute to multi-center trials as soon as the Argentine regulatory framework allows. Subscribe to this channel because the next story comes from another location on this same map and promises to be just as hard to believe. For anyone who feels this story resonates with them, whether as someone who has experienced treatment-resistant depression, as a family member of someone who is, or as a mental health professional who has witnessed the limitations of available tools, the most direct way to stay informed is through the publications of the Johns Hopkins University Psychedelic Assisted Psychotherapy Group, which are mostly open access, and through MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Consortium for the Study of Psychedelics, based in California, which publishes regular updates on the status of ongoing clinical trials. In Latin America, the Psychoactive Plant Research Network, coordinated from Medellin, regularly updates its publications on the University of Antioquia's website. And if this story has sparked your curiosity about Shipibo knowledge itself, beyond pharmacology, there's a path the researchers themselves recommend. Read the publications of the ethnobotanists who worked with the communities, starting with Luis Eduardo Luna, whose doctoral thesis on Amazonian vegetalism, defended at Stockholm University in 1986 and published as a book, remains the most comprehensive description available in academic literature of the knowledge system we're discussing. And listen, if possible, to the voices of the Onanya themselves, several of whom have participated in international conferences in recent years, and whose presentations are available on video. One image lingers after studying this story for the time it took to prepare this script. It's the image of a Shipibo elder from the Ucayali region preparing the liana over the fire, in the darkness of the jungle, with the patience of someone who knows that what they are doing has meaning, even if the outside world doesn't yet recognize it. It's likely that many of these men and women died during the rubber boom without being able to pass on all they knew. It's also likely that right now, in some community along the Juruá or Marañón rivers, there is an elderly elder whose knowledge has no apprentice to receive it. What Harvard is studying today existed before Harvard existed. It will continue to exist, with or without the papers, in the memory of those who didn't need an academic journal to know it was real.